right? You're saying that we need the proletariat.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So like,
what I'm saying is that I think that by Marx and Engels' terms, I don't believe that this is a very useful way of talking anymore. But by their terms, I believe your position is reactionary and counter-revolutionary.
Wow. Ooh.
Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left?
So today on Why Left, we get to have Doug Lain on. Doug, who I talk to when I do the Sublation podcast. And now we get to talk about the Platypus panel that Doug and Dave did together, which was on the question of why does society need politics? Doug fenced hilariously with Bill Ayers, the Weather Underground guy, at this panel. Doug got in all kinds of zingers. He was very funny. He had the crowd in stitches at multiple points. But as a consequence of how much fun Doug was having fencing with Bill Ayers, there were certain things between Doug and Dave that I felt didn't fully get discussed or fleshed out. And I wanted to get them discussed. And I had my hand up to ask a question, but my question was never picked. So I didn't get to make Doug and Dave talk about the things that I wanted them to talk about. So now I get to do that. And I'm so happy, so totally happy. The thing I really want to raise to start is that Dave in his talk brought up Marx's quote about the sack of potatoes, suggesting that maybe we don't have something that looks very much like a society, but instead is the post-class fractured mass. A post-class condition in some sense, although Dave was careful to qualify that this doesn't mean for him that class doesn't matter or is no longer an objective force in people's lives. Rather, it's a condition that is to do with, as Dave was putting it, people's ability to communicate, speak to each other, be understood, something along those lines. And Doug seems to be proceeding instead from the view that society still is something that we have, still is something we can meaningfully intervene and work with. And it seems to me that these are quite sharply different pictures of what exists and therefore what politics would do, what politics would interface with or work with. So I want to start by throwing it to you guys and going, Doug, Dave, does that sound like a fair description of the different views? And how would you try to persuade the other insofar as it is?
Right. I just want to, I think maybe before we both give our positions or whatever, add a little bit more in terms of our, what we each think may have been an essential intervention. And so Doug, for instance, you calling Ayers a Democrat and then him saying he's not one. And I'm very curious to hear more about that. But I guess the thing I want to say is I framed it as though I was on a panel with three ideal types. And I called you the old left representative, and then I called Bill Ayers the new left, and then Higgins the fusionist. And then you corrected me on that. But I would like to, at one point in this conversation, circle back to what I take to be the essential, fundamental, distinction between all variants of old and then new left, which I think comes down to the conception of a revolutionary subject, which you said, at the end of the day, we still just need to organize the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is why I always bring it back to, well, that is the old left fundamentally. But so that's kind of what I'm thinking. And I think that the potato class fractured mass thesis, that's where it becomes a problem potentially for old and new left positions.
Okay. So I'm going to start with Benjamin's question, or what Benjamin wants us to draw out, and then I'm going to address this new left, old left distinctions again. It's not as though the fact that society continues to exist and civil society organizing continues to exist means that there is a class politics in that society. Those are different propositions, I think. That I think we operate in a free market economy, a consumer society, based on laws and norms, and that for the most part, a lot of the people in that society operate quite willingly and freely, legally and ethically, and on the basis of modern bourgeois values, and that they also organize together in their own interests on various levels, maybe far less so than they did 25, 30 years ago. We're bowling alone more than we did in the past, but nonetheless, especially amongst working class people, I believe that there's quite a lot of social life still out there. That's just my starting proposition. So that means to describe them as all of us as potatoes in a sack. It is probably both right and wrong. It depends on what it takes for you to not be a potato. If you are simply working to survive in a social way with others in the system as it is, then what you might be said to be doing is, jockeying for or cooperating to provide one another with a comfortable position within the sack. And if you are trying to transform yourself and your conditions so that you become active subjects shaping the future, then you are no longer a potato. But so if that's the standard, then okay, sure, we're all potatoes in a sack. But but we're not simply passive objects of a society that operates completely automatically. So that would be my answer. I'm not sure if Dave and I would disagree on this. And as far as the new left and the old left, perhaps I'm struggling to return to the old left, but it's worth noting that the sectarian left, the Trotskyist left, the Marxist-Leninist left continue to exist throughout the new left. And the question from my perspective, the questions of strategy, political strategy, and the search for a political subject aren't what defines the distinction between the old and the new, but rather what defines the distinction is really just the level of defeat that the left had faced, the level of that fracturing into potatoes that we had experienced, along with the level of dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union and really existing socialism. So I, more than most people in Platypus, maintain a certain level of skepticism about the framing of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Like when I say we need a dictatorship of the proletariat, I say that because I hope for the creative power of the workers when they have political power to really transform the mode of production, and don't see the dictatorship itself as much more than instrumental to the aims of socialism. I tend to think that people like Catrone and other people within the Platypus affiliated society are less concerned about what will happen after political power is achieved by the workers, but rather they see the primary task as achieving that political power, and then there's sort of a leap into the void there. So my time with the Marxist Humanist Initiative has set me up as wanting to think about rather utopian schemes to overcome the foundations of capitalist society in terms of reproducing commodities and measuring value in terms of labor time and so forth. Which you don't often hear the people around Chris Catrone speak to. And they're rather critical of the work critique in the value form people, and I am too, but more from within that domain rather than on the outside of it. Like I'll participate in the internal debates and battles around whether it should be called value theory or value form theory or all that kind of stuff, or at least I used to. And that still informs my thinking.
Well, I like that a lot.
I'm hearing
I like that a lot.
that there's some level of agreement that some fracturing has occurred. But perhaps there might still be a difference as to the political consequences of that fracturing. Or perhaps, to what degree are we still able to communicate with a public or with a demos, something like that?
Mm.
Do you think there is still a public that we can communicate with despite this fracturing? Or is there a greater level of estrangement such that when you make an intervention, you're only able to talk to some fragment?
I want to say there's two sides of that I think you're touching on, Benjamin, that get right to what I wanted to kind of do to set up here. We're talking about the stakes and consequences of the fracturing. And then we're also talking about the nature of the fracturing. So what is the kind of fracturing? So for instance, I'll hear Doug or Ashley Frowley saying it's the petty bourgeois ideology or approach of identity politics that is in part to blame. Obviously, that is in part to. I think we can all agree that is a symptom of this post-class fractured massification. The question is it the cause or is it the symptom, right? What are the fundamental causes? And then is it the main thing that stands in the way of the proletariat organizing? Now, I want to say something about the nature of the fracturing later. I can kind of address that later. But in terms of the stakes and consequences of the fracturing and why I stopped speaking to, for, about centering or prioritizing the proletariat. The way that I'm thinking about this is the proletariat is not synonymous with the working class. The proletariat was supposed to be the most revolutionary arm of the working class. And it was thought to be the most revolutionary for reasons that made a lot of sense in the time of Charles Dickens and that have gradually become less reasonable based on certain changes in the material conditions, chief among which I have, at least this was what I was going to say in my opening remarks if I had read my opening remarks, geographical concentration, military-style discipline, and the fact that its hands were literally on the levers that made the world go round. Combine all of that with the most important piece, the advanced workers still existed. Advanced workers were the people at a factory who knew how to do everything. And without the managers or the bosses, they could actually run shop. And the thing is they actually had the trust networks throughout the factory built up with the rank and file. But outside of the trust, they also had the knowledge base. So advanced workers were gutted by progressive education, starting with Woodrow Wilson, and it was done on purpose through Taylorization. So that's a whole thing. We can get into Bernays, and of course, I know you're familiar with Adam Curtis and how that all comes in as well. Mm-hmm. So those are ways that the proletariat becomes fractured and therefore de-radicalized or de-revolution. Its revolutionary potential, it's undermined. But the quote, just to base us back in Marx here, and I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's from the 18th Brumaire. But for folks who are kind of curious about the potatoes, for folks who, and Benjamin, maybe I can actually get you to use your Smeagol voice here. Come on, how does it go? Taters? What's taters, precious?
What's taters, precious? What's taters, huh?
Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew? Taters! It's taters. Okay, so what are we talking about? Marx says, the small-holding peasants, this is why he's saying that the peasants are reactionary as opposed to revolutionary. The small-holding peasants form an enormous mass whose members live in similar conditions. So they are like a class in that they live in the similar conditions, but without entering into manifold relations with each other. Their mode of production isolates them from one another instead of bringing them into mutual intercourse, skipping way down. Thus, the great mass of the French nation is formed by the simple addition of homologous magnitudes, such as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. So just clarify my position and turn it back over to you here, Doug. I'm not proposing that we're in the same situation as those French peasants were at that time in the 1850s. What I'm proposing is that there's some kind of potatoification occurring so that though we are in the same class together, all three of us, though we are all in the same class, our revolutionary potential is undermined by the way that we produce, but also the way that we consume. That would be the additional factor. And then I would bring in the medium, gerrymandering, Befindlichkeit, and progressive schooling as the chief causes or underrepresented, or how do we say, Marxists tend to not tarry with these three factors in the potatoification. And then I think that the essential question for us is, what kind of potatoification are we talking about? Are they mashed potatoes? Are they boiled potatoes? Do they go in a stew? What kind of, are they French fried potatoes? I want to know what kinds of potatoes, because the question is it's a question of putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. And as I've seen a little of your work recently, not much, but the one thing I did see recently on X, and I think it's something you've been on about recently with all of these tariffs, is that you cannot be against the tariffs and be for, or at least bringing back manufacture to the United States and be left. And that's because you hold this line about the left being for the working class. And the fact is, we need a proletariat to have a left. Is that right? Am I correct in following? Because I take this to be the stakes and consequences.
Okay, so I don't remember the exact tweet you're referring to precisely, but I do remember saying something along the lines about Kyle Kalinske, that when he shared this meme of fat, sad Americans doing work that was beneath them in the factory, that he had abandoned the left. But that isn't to say that I am pining for factory work either. It's not like I would want to say, oh, well, if you're in the service sector, you're not a worker, but if you're in a factory, then we can. I mean, that's not how I think. There is a chance that factory work will pay a bit better and might be more stable, possibly. That's at least conceivable, plausible. But
I'm sympathetic, by the way.
Huh?
Oh, I'm just saying, I am sympathetic to that position. Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't. So my thought is, if you are telling the workers that what they should hope for is more welfare spending and a Green New Deal and abundance rather than jobs, you've lost the plot. You're not on the left. You're a progressive Democrat, and you're going to get nowhere if your hope is to regain working class support, which you may not need. You may not even need that to win elections. I'm not in the thick of it as far as calculating all that out. So there's that. But I want to talk about potatoes a bit more.
Yeah.
In the 18th Primary, he was talking about the peasants, and you told me you understand that we're not talking about peasants today, right? But it does seem to me that the potential for politics is different amongst people who have to cooperate, at least through the market, in order to survive, rather than simply be subsistence farmers. That there's a way in which our society sets up interdependence and therefore collective organization at least as a potentiality, even as it pushes against it, like that. So we simply are in a different epoch, and we cannot be potatoes in the same way. We're not talking about the potatoes that Marx was talking about, but as I said earlier, I'm kind of coming out of the New Left, or my starting point is New Left is the '60s, really. In particular, it's Guy Debord. One of big influence is on me, along with Raoul Vaneigem, I think is how you say his name, who wrote the Revolution of Everyday Life. And they were concerned about how society was turning us into couch potatoes, spectators, and how we were being led to imagine that the future was already like on display in some gift shop or in some museum, or had been filmed in advance, that everything was predetermined. And even as the decisions were being made, they would appear as outside of the domain of political thought and political action, especially when it comes to what I guess we can call the public. I mean, Ben, you talked about, do I believe there is a public? And I almost think like that's the wrong kind of question for me, because the public relates to the state. The public is what you want to gain legitimacy from in order to maintain power, maybe. And the question is there a society, not is there a public? Because I'm not seeking to, in an electoral fashion, immediately gain state power. And so I don't need consensus on that level in order to start to seek civil social organizing. And like I'm seeking it out as something I think I can discover because it already exists, rather than trying to create it from the ground up. The point is, the platypus society is very left oriented, and so am I. The point is not to try to start by fixing the society we're in, but by fixing the left, getting it reacquainted with reality, breaking it from the spectacle, turning us into something other than couch potatoes, but not in because we think everyday people are just potatoes that we should try to put in our sack. Does that make sense?
That's clarifying. So you don't think that it's necessary for society to be as cohesive as something like a public or a demos for the kind of politics that you think we need to be doable? Or maybe you wouldn't call it a politics, it would be pre-political. So it would be some kind of social organizing which is compatible with a greater level of division than we might associate with a term like public or demos.
I think we have a public or a demos now, but that public is denied politics. That if it right in the United States, I mean, in China it's maybe different, but in the United States, that public operates through division, lack of clarity, propaganda, inactivity, the limitations of choices, even sometimes acts of terrorism. That's all how the public is managed. That's the demos in action. That's democracy in the United States.
You say terrorism is democracy? I just have to get it straight. What?
Yeah.
The acts of terrorism can be a big part of that?
Yeah, acts of terrorism are a part of how mass democracy functions in the United States. Bill Ayers, supports that thesis. I mean, that's why I called him a Democrat.
So he denied that he was a terrorist during the panel.
And a Democrat.
He confessed.
And a Democrat. Yes, he also denied both of those things.
He denied them, and then he confessed to them. He's like, I told those kids that, Luigi Mangione wasn't worth supporting. But then 3 days later, when all those memes came out, I decided maybe I was wrong. And I'm not a Democrat, but even if even if the protests are being called by organizations that you can fund through Act Blue, in other words, being organized by the Democrats, we should definitely go and join them. Why? Because young people who don't know any better need our support, i.e., need to be corralled. So
See, even when he's not here, he exercises a certain dominion over what we talk about because he's just such a magnet for attention. The things that he did cause everyone to focus on him. And that is in part the function of that kind of activity, is to suck up all the air out of the room and prevent other kinds of things from being discussed or thought about.
Okay, right.
There was a question I wanted to ask.
That's an important point, though, about is terrorism a part of mass democracy? Am I right to say that Bill Ayers and the Weather Underground were acting as Democrats? Because democracy doesn't mean we sit down and we reason it all out and we have a clear picture of what society is and where we want it to go. And democracy is you duke it out through propaganda to win votes and take power, and then even in power, you duke it out to try to execute your will and to pass legislation. Democracy is a kind of war, a good portion of the time, and it's political, meaning it's all operating around a body of armed men who are the final deciders. When I said I didn't think politics was going to be necessary for all of human history, I meant we wouldn't have to self-alienate to have violence in the background to dictate to us what our relations were going to be based on ultimately.
Yeah, because you're understanding politics in that very Marxian way as a kind of alienated decision making.
Right.
What was the term we were talking about on that episode we did, Benjamin, about the Overton window? Was it mainstreaming? Oh, and the radical flank theory. So I kind of wanted to bring it back to just still my clarifying question on what you're saying about democracy and terrorism here, Doug. And I know, Benjamin, you've got a question you're chomping on here, but just a quick yes or no. Are you saying you're not being prescriptive? You're not saying this is the way things ought to be. You're just saying descriptively this sort of the Mangione or the Bill Ayers as the radical flank for like a sort of Overton window approach to democratic parliamentary or democratic republic politics in the US or in the UK. Like it's all just part of the same thing, is what you're saying. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. You're not advocating for it on my channel.
I absolutely am opposed to it.
He was not making a normative claim. Let's be clear. He was not normatively supporting it. And indeed, he was framing it as something, I think that performs a kind of distracting role and which therefore helps the Democratic Party, not merely through something like radical flank theory necessarily, but just by being something really horrible and obscene that attracts all of the attention and then permits the state to make further interventions to further securitize society, I would think.
Yeah, it does both. I mean, it does distract the left that wants to be socialist or that wants to be Marxist or wants to be revolutionary into an activity that ultimately is aligned with the purposes of the state as it is, and particularly the Democratic Party, but not only. But it then gives both the Democrats and the Republicans the excuse to tighten security and control. So even though Tim Walz is up there kind of half encouraging this activity, ultimately, the Democrats are going to vote for the next version of the Patriot Act to fight domestic terrorism. They have to. They're the force of civilization. They're the force of law and order. They can't abide what they created. So,
yeah. So I want to ask a question to take it back to the society thing.
Yeah.
One of the questions I wanted to ask was to do with corporations.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this might be clarifying. For you guys, are corporations social organizations? Are they political organizations? Are they both social and political organizations? Are they neither? Are they to do with fascism? Are they a continuation of the schooling system by alternative means? What are corporations? Because that would be something that would sharply distinguish, I think, our period from, say, 1850 when the Sack of Potatoes was written. and would either give rise to a different version of that would have maybe some of the stakes Dave is describing, but would work in a very corporatized way, and so would look very different from the peasant stuff. Or perhaps corporations have a function in retaining to some degree the coherence of a notion of society.
There was a movie that came out, I think in like 2004, somewhere around that time, called The Corporation. You ever seen it? You know this movie?
I've meant to watch it. I've meant to watch it. Yeah.
Yeah. Noam Chomsky's in it. It's I think made by the same production studio that made Manufacturing Consent, I think. And they asked the question, if the corporation was a person, what kind of person would it be? And then the answer is a sociopath. But in that movie, I think that if I'm remembering correctly, and really I didn't go to Cambridge. I don't know everything. You tell me, Ben, isn't it the case that the first corporations arose in the late 19th century, where people would band together and have legal protection as individuals from the consequences of the corporations spending and investments and things like that?
Yeah. It depends on how you define this word. So you can find in the literature arguments for, say, corporate ownership of property coming out of the monasteries in the High Middle Ages. You can find an argument that the Hobbesian state is a corporate form. You can find arguments, that would classify the East India Company as some type of corporation, and others who would go, no, very clearly that's not a corporation, that's something different. But then, yes, there would be a general consensus that by the late 19th century, certainly we have what we would recognize as modern corporations.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I understand what a corporation is because I started one up. I have an LLC that I'm a member of, along with a couple other people who put in money. And so corporations are legal entities that allow people to bring money together to spend on productive activity. And while the people who are running that corporation are not putting their own livelihoods or own cash or their own futures on the line, they're kind of protected from, like, if this LLC were to go out of business, I wouldn't have to sell my house, right?
Yeah. In a lot of political theory literature, especially some of the more recent stuff, there's an emphasis on an impersonal quality to corporations as a form, that they produce decisions that can't be reduced to any particular person or to any set of members. So some entities that we call corporations are still plausibly in private hands, or there still seems to be one particular person who makes most of the decisions. And this would be a somewhat more mixed kind of situation. Whereas corporation in that purer form has that, as you were emphasizing, depersonalizing quality, right? The corporation that you start, it exists separately and distinctively from you. Right. And if it goes bankrupt, you don't go bankrupt. But then this can be taken further to the point at which you have decisions that are being taken that don't seem to come from anybody, that nobody would own personally. And indeed, every particular person might hate the decision, and yet nonetheless, it would seem impossible to stop it.
Yeah. And I don't know if that, I mean, like, in terms of just formally, I don't know if I would want to say that the real corporation has that character, but because running an LLC, I feel as though we arrive at decisions that often enough I lead, since we make them. And I can imagine that even a very big corporation might have a powerful CEO who dominates the board, like in the TV show Severance, right? Right.
What percentage of the stake do you own in your corporation?
A little. I own a majority share,
like 50% or 80%.
Well, look, on the other hand, I don't own anything. For the IRS, I have no. Don't tax me.
The microphone in front of you, the computer in front of you, the logo, the name, the magazine. If push comes to shove,
let me just put it this way: we have never distributed profits. Okay, we've only reinvested.
Same,
So I just
same,
want to clarify that for
Well, I
anybody
asked-
in the
well, Doug,
IRS who might be watching.
I want to clarify, because maybe so far I kind of fell into, like, I was listening to you guys on your podcast, and I realized I should be playing a role here. So I want to see if I can stir the pot a little bit. I also have an LLC. I also have an LLC here. But I think that my dad, who is a Trump supporter, who loves, a sort of libertarian conservative capitalism, he is going to like what you're saying a little too much, and I want to see if we can differentiate, because he tends to do this analogy thing where he's thinking of the small businessman as analogous to Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. And there's a world of difference here. So what you're saying with your LLC as a basic legal protection for you and maybe a couple of other people involved is very different from a publicly traded corporation. I mean, that's on Wall Street, and it has a fiduciary legal responsibility to its shareholders to make a profit, even when that might go against your own creative, entrepreneurial wisdom and your ethical responsibilities, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
there's no mechanism for Sublation to dump Doug on the basis that he's not generating enough profit.
There is.
You could do that to Musk on almost everything he does, right?
I have an operating agreement that set up the LLC because it's a for-profit LLC and not a nonprofit. I have a fiduciary responsibility for to the shareholders to try to maximize profit, or I do.
Oh, I didn't realize that there was that mechanism for sublation.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not so much a point about sublation, but about corporations in general.
But then the question becomes, well, it's very, very difficult to demonstrate I'm not doing that. It's almost impossible to demonstrate that I'm not doing that. Because every decision I've made has been made in the effort to expand the LLC, to make it more secure, to be able to hire more staff. I've not generally thought primarily about distributing profits, but as a startup, I wouldn't be, right? So, but it is in that operating agreement that I have that responsibility. And if it could be shown that I was making decisions that I knew were going to undermine our ability to be profitable in the future or immediately, especially if it could be shown that I was doing so on the basis of helping my brother-in-law or something like that, I could easily get thrown out, and conceivably that shell of protection around me that the LLC has could be punctured and I could be sued personally.
I guess I better keep these receipts I've got about your business practices on the down.
No, I mean, look, I have actually had to wrangle with the legal system because I created this LLC a number of times, starting before I did when I left Zero Books, and then a couple of times since. And so I have become quite aware of what the legal framework is. I mean, not, on the level of a PhD or something, but I under at least a working businessman's conception of what this LLC is and what a corporation is. And okay, so Elon Musk and publicly trading, look, he's making a lot more. It's much more profitable, and he's much more integrated with the state, right? Because he relies on state contracts, which Sublation does not have. So on that level, there's an integration with the state.
Well, that's the thing. You said something about living in a free market society, and I'm thinking about the legal oligarchical capture of government and the bureaucratization of capitalism in the last 100 years. And it's like you kind of get to have some distance from that, whereas those guys, they don't get to be where they are without taking the products of public investments and then privatizing them, right? So like that, we're special like that. We get to kind of be pure. We're not like that. We're not doing what Bill Gates has done his entire life, right?
Well, really, the motivation in the question is not so much about what you guys have done or haven't done as LLC holders. The motivation of the question is really about trying to get at whether the spread of the corporation as a form has changed in some way what we have, such that older notions from a time before the corporation as a form spread and became dominant of society or of politics don't quite capture what now goes on.
See,
Right.
as a
No,
Marxist. Okay, go
I do
ahead.
want to take I want to take a crack at answering this question,
Okay.
or at least I don't want to answer it. I want to present my position, okay? Because and then I'm very curious to hear what you guys will do with it. But I'm going to get a little meta in a way that I kind of hate when debate kids do it, but I feel like I actually kind of have to, because that is sort of where my position is, which is to say the terms of the debate, the frame of the question itself, the frame of the question itself presuppose too much, or to answer it, or to even. So you're asking, what are they? What are corporations, or have they spread so much, or are they civic in nature? Are they social? Are they political? And this is one of the things that I would have done on the panel had I, if we'd had more time, is to say that how we define these terms says more about us than it does about the situation. Now, that's an operating assumption for me. It's not a dogmatic belief, but it's because we have our own political goals or our social goals, and so we operationalize certain definitions, and we also play within certain frames that can benefit our either position or our preconceived notions. And so what I'm going to avoid doing is social ontology. So if I was to do social ontology right now, I would say, well, a corporation is, or they are, right? I'd be using these.
Yeah. Perhaps more helpfully, how should we understand corporations given what it is that we're interested in doing? That would be more specifically how to put it. How ought we to think about them? What would be useful or helpful?
Right. And so then I want to say or propose that to talk about the corporation, to me at face value seems like a fetishization of the institutional matrix. Because, and this brings it back to the suggestion you had made, Benjamin, are they an extension of the schooling system? I mean, there's the obvious sort of way that they are, because, at Boise State University, where I'm currently teaching, this is my last semester there teaching, Micron is on a lot of the buildings. Simplot is on a lot of the buildings. Albertsons is on some of the buildings. Taco Bell used to be on one of the buildings and now it got replaced by whatever. So the point is that for sure, the corporations have a vested interest in using these as recruitment hubs for their corporations. And that's true of this K through 12 system as well. The Idaho Board of Education, for instance, it doesn't have a single person on it who's not primarily a businessman. These are not teachers who were across left and right agreed to be the best teachers in their communities. No, these are businessmen. And their entire idea of the schooling system is a very corporate idea of a certain kind of individual that they are trying to select through schooling. But we can't separate that, right, from the prisons or from any of these other institutions. And that's why I say matrix, is because they all kind of hold each other together.
Let me take it to a more banal level.
I do want to get there, but really quick. And I think the time, if we were to count the time.
Well, listen, I can go a little over. I'm looking at how much time we spent, and I'm thinking about when I actually have a drop dead, I have to be off the call moment. And it's a little further out than I was going to do some work on the film, but I can put that off a little bit. So we can go a little longer. No rush.
Okay. Oh, no rush. Good to know. Thank you. Well, and Benjamin, I just want to say because to me, this corporation question, it's not on my agenda. I have 20 pages here, and that's not one of them. But I did just bring it back into my agenda. But I want to bring it back to the couch potato, right?
I want to get there too.
Okay, so we have amusing ourselves to death, which comes to mind for me. You're bringing up the Bowling Alone book. I'm thinking of Amusing Ourselves by Neil Postman. Now, there's a trajectory though that I want to establish not historically, and then I want to get your guys' take on it. And maybe we can bring that back to the corporate individual and the production of that. But before we do that, I want to do it within the context of what I'll say is the John Jones to Joe Sixpack to I don't know what would be a name for a person on TikTok. Okay, so we'll figure that out in a second. But
Karen, I don't know.
Karen on TikTok. So John Jones is not just a name I'm pulling out of my ass. And neither is Joe Sixpack. If you think about manufacturing consent, Chomsky keeps referring to Joe Sixpack, and that is the couch potato subject that you're referring to. But before Joe Sixpack was a man named John Jones. And I think it's illuminating and grounding for the conversation to read a short quote by Edward Bernays as he describes the life of John Jones. So this is either your grandfather or your great-grandfather. Every one of us was kind of like this guy. If he was lower middle class to middle class, it goes like this. He says, yet it must be remembered that and this is from propaganda, right? It must be remembered that these thousands of groups interlace. John Jones, besides being a Rotarian, is member of a church, a fraternal order, of a political party, of a charitable organization, of a professional association, of a local chamber of commerce, of a league for or against prohibition, or of a society for or against lowering the tariff, or of a golf club. We might also think a bowling league. The opinions which he receives as a Rotarian, he will tend to disseminate in the other groups in which he may have influence. This invisible, intertwining structure of groupings and associations is the mechanism by which democracy has organized its group mind and simplified its mass thinking. To deplore the existence of such a mechanism is to ask for a society such as it never was or never will be, to admit that I don't care. The main point here is that John Jones was a civic person, very embedded in these webs of association in a way that obviously the bowling alone, couch potato, Joe Sixpack is not. Well, what we have today is someone who is a lot more embedded. This person feels like he or she or they or it is John Jones. But that's the simulacrum, right? That's why you want to break the spectacle, because they feel very engaged as they consume from the niches that sustain their hyper, I'll say competitive, and what's the other word? Isolated, and what's the other? Competitive, isolated, and defensive characters or identities. Those hyper aggressive, competitive, defensive identities are cooked up in a certain model of schooling and then sustained outside of school or work by a certain kind of media engagement that collapses, or as Baudrillard will say, implodes space and time. Because for John Jones, he had to get up and go out and go to these places, or at least read the newspaper and the newsletters for those, where people were engaging. But now you never get away from it, but you're also never in it. So this is the potatoification. And then I'm going to propose that we're talking about something a little bit more like shredded and then deep fried hash browns, right? We're talking about someone whose identity is not, it doesn't have the time to be with itself because of this constant, or we say instantaneous access to the other, which is really this corporate other that is preying on us. Maybe that brings it back to your point, Benjamin. But I kind of wanted to set that trajectory between John Jones, Joe Sixpack, and whatever we have today, and then say, considering the fact that the conditions have changed so much, it is up to us to reinterpret the world and come up with a new, if not revolutionary subject, at least a new method of organizing that doesn't put the cart before the horse by taking an old category like the proletariat and putting it at the front and center, because it could just as easily be moms. And I will hold that line. Moms are more revolutionary than the proletariat.
Okay. Well, I completely reject the distinction between moms and the proletariat. But you raise a lot of good points, right? And that is what we're wrestling with, and I think that's where the New Left ended up, trying to figure out, now that the proletariat had been destroyed, where was the revolutionary subject and how did it relate to class? And so I agree that the task today is not to organize the proletariat, because the proletariat is exactly kind of like what you're suggesting, only it's a member John Jones would also be a member of a socialist party, along with some of these other civil society organizations, to be a proletariat, right? And a union,
Right.
so we're not dealing with the
Yep.
proletariat.
Bernays kind of conveniently leaves out the fact that the union would have been a really big factor for a lot of the John Joneses, right?
Yeah. So we're not dealing with the proletariat. The proletariat is what's missing. Absolutely. In other words, an organized, self-conscious working class that is actually aimed at the very least, organizing collectively to protect their own interests as a class, to make sure that their labor power it fetches the highest price it can, that they have the best working conditions they can, and so on. Right? That's largely disappeared. Only 10% of the workers are unionized, and a good portion of them are actually public workers, which, from my way of thinking, that means that they're very, very unlikely to be part of the proletariat at any point in the future. So then there's the question of society and the character of society and the potential in society for to reform the proletariat, to bring that back into existence. And it will be a very difficult process, but I do think that, like, rather than focus on the corporation or the way in which capitalists are operating today, we should think about what created the situation where the proletariat could be defeated and what's holding them back from reorganizing. And like someone like Guy Debord would say that the problem is the cadres. The problem is the left. The problem is the way that the Bolshevik Party betrayed the proletariat, and the way in which the socialists conceive of their project. That's what Debord would say, and he would even go further to say, you scratch a socialist member of some cadre, you're going to find a secret agent for the state.
Yeah.
And which is what I was saying to Bill Ayers, right? That's what I was accusing Bill Ayers of being. So I think that my task is to advise would-be socialists to not become secret agents for the state, not to lead themselves and whatever workers they can recruit away from independent proletarian organizing. The other thing, though, that did affect, I think, the change in the character of the working class and made things more difficult was industrialization and the rise of the machine. And that's in Capital, Volume 1. I think it's chapter 15. And, he describes what you pointed out earlier, in the 19th century, the way in which there was a de-skilling of the working class through industrialization. And so rather than having tools which the worker used to create his product, the worker attached himself to the machine and was used by it to create commodities and products. And so that involved a de-skilling, that involved a diminishing of self-direction and autonomous thinking. There was a massive, there was a brain drain within the working class as kids were put to work in factories and didn't go to school, didn't read, not even the Bible, So, and we've dealt with that on different levels. It's gotten better and worse ever since the Industrial Revolution has come along. So, that's another factor, and that's making it difficult for the working class to organize, and it's one based on the way in which they produce the world. But even so, they're not the potatoes that the peasants were, because Because on some level, they're all entrepreneurs. On some level, they're all bourgeois because they have to get out there and sell their labor power. They can't simply go stay in on their farm, grow their crops, alienate themselves from other people, only know their own town. They have to be able to move sometimes. They have to have a network of support or association in order to, if they become unemployed, find work again. They have to know their industry, know where they might go to find a job that they are qualified to do. So that brings them together already as a class in mutual support, even as they're competing with each other. So
It does it.
Well, there was a very interesting point in what Doug said, where he said that public sector workers, even though unionized, are in a kind of employment which estranges them in such a way that they can't be the proletariat. And that the reason I raised the corporation question, it wasn't really to ask about capitalists or elites. It was to ask about whether participating within corporate forums, within corporate structures of the kind that exist post the Wilsonian turn and the bureaucratization and the human resources departments and all of that stuff, whether that has a similar kind of effect, even on workers in the private sector who don't work for the state, but who work for other corporations. So that some of the corporate theory supposes that the modern state and the corporation are really quite similar and perhaps even the same kind of organization, such that workers who work for large corporations, for TNCs, are in a situation that is similar to, in important respects, that of public sector workers. And then that would raise a question about whether there is another sizable part of the working class which is estranged by its participation within the relations. That would, of course, be different from the ways in which peasants are estranged, because you can work for a corporation and still have knowledge of an industry and still need to potentially move around. The things Doug said there at the end, I think all hold true for people who work for for large corporations. But I do wonder if nonetheless there is a meaningful difference between working for a corporation influenced by 20th century managerialism and the kind of employment that somebody would have engaged in the 19th century, in the very early 20th century, before that managerial mode was brought in and became dominant.
The bureaucratized corporate state, right?
Yes. And also I think there's a lot of people, when they talk about fascism, are focused so much on trying to emphasize that these corporations are appendage to the state or that they're statified, but also there might just be something about that corporate mode, because it has all of the same kind of managerial facets that the state has. It has all of the same kinds of appendages and rules and structures, all of those impersonal modes that make decisions appear reified, that it might have similar kinds of effects, even notwithstanding whether the corporation is in some kind of tight relationship to the state that you could simply point to, which is why I didn't really want it to go in the Musk direction, because Musk is just too overtly tied to the state in very obvious ways. But what about a corporation that isn't very overtly obviously tied to the state, but is still large and has this kind of impersonal character? What about working for Pepsi? What about working for General Mills? It seems to me that this is perhaps a different kind of subject gets produced by that than, say, working in the 19th century.
Dave, do you want to address what he's saying first? Or
I want you to be able to in your response to Doug, also bring it back to the four major factors that I pointed to as to why the proletariat is not most revolutionary wing of the working class, or in fact is almost insofar as it exists, really stands out as a great example of how fractured we are today. And that was the geographical distribution. The de-skilling you touched on, it changes in quantity and quality at the turn of the 20th century. Between the beginning of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century, it's like a whole new thing. And then what were the other ones there? Let me see if that's got got it handy somewhere. But I mainly wanted to. The thing is we can't. The idea that we have to organize people, organize the proletariat to come back from the geographical. Remember, it was concentrated. Now it's not concentrated. So we'd have to reconcentrate the proletariat for it to be the most revolutionary. Then also bring back the military discipline, bring back the advanced workers, which would mean replacing college-educated people and their managerial function in the factories, but also its disembodied form through automation, its disembodied form through sophisticated forms of engineering that make these hyper ergonomic sort of friction-free spaces like Amazon, right? Where I've worked at a couple of warehouses, and I can tell you it's very advanced. It basically makes the managers replaceable as the workers, and you can pay them barely any more than the workers. And so that's another 21st century change from the 20th century. And then the fact that its hands were literally on the levers that made the world go round. And so it's like, it seems just we're so far from that to say that what must be organized is the proletariat, when the content of the proletariat, or maybe I should say its form, is the only reason it was focused on the way it was by Marx and Engels at a time when everybody was aware that the working class was rising up. They said it's not going to be all these other sections of the working class. No, those ones are reactionary. They're all on their way out. They only fight the bourgeoisie to maintain their position. This is in the Principles of Communism. They're saying that it's the most revolutionary for reasons that they explicitly wrote down, but then also the literal actual fact that it did have this geographical concentration, military style discipline. Its hands were literally on the levers, meaning if people stepped back, the world stopped moving. So the dictatorship of the proletariat, as well as a general strike, a more anarchist approach, were both way more feasible. And so, like, I get that moms are a part of what you're calling the proletariat, if I use your term, but also
I didn't. I'm not saying that we even have a proletariat, right? Like I want to point that out. Like, I don't.
But it could include moms.
It could include moms, but it does not.
You are saying we need a proletariat, though, right? You're saying that we need the proletariat,
right? Yeah. Okay. So, like,
what I'm saying is that I think that by Marx and Engels' terms, I don't believe that this is a very useful way of talking anymore. But by their terms, I believe your position is reactionary and counter-revolutionary.
Wow. Ooh.
Their terms. If you read the Principles of Communism.
Well, right, but the Principles of Communism were written at a time when there was a proletariat, when there was a revolutionary struggle going on, where the question of which part of society is the most revolutionary was a live question.
Sure.
Right? And which part of the organized working class within unions and parties was a living question. Judging one socialist party against another was an important thing to do, right? Yeah. But today, what I'm trying to convince people is we still have a society, not that we have a proletariat. But
you said at the panel, though. Maybe I misunderstood, but on the panel, and maybe it would save us a lot of time for you to clarify. But I thought on the panel that you did say that the solution is still the dictatorship of the proletariat.
If you want to overcome capitalism, yes, the eventual solution, I believe, will be the dictatorship of the proletariat. But before we can even begin to organize a proletariat, we have to recognize what the aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat or socialism would be. And the aim of the dictatorship of the proletariat or socialism would not be to create a perfectly harmonious version of capitalism where politics would function smoothly and we could continue a class-based society into perpetuity. The aim of socialism is for society, this relatively new thing, to take charge of itself, govern itself, create its own future, create its own present. Be self-reflective, lose its class character, lose its political character. That's the aim of socialism, is the emancipation of society. And what I want to say is we have a society. There is still a society. As fucked up as it is, even though it's a society of the spectacle, it is still the society, right? And we should work with it, within it, with workers. I don't want to say just people, but I would say like that's a better starting point than we should work with the Democratic Party.
Right.
But
Right.
we should work
Right.
to organize people who have to work to live, people who draw a wage, and in order and try to
And that would
organize
include
them
people who are
independently.
that would, for you, just to clarify for my own audience, as well as my dad, who I'm going to make listen to this. We are all, you would also say people who are pro-life, pro-gun, just go down the line. A lot of people who or maybe have their entire lives voted down like this sort of Republican ticket. It would mean not excluding them just because, say, they have some conservative views, right?
Look, yes, absolutely. I would want to work with people who have different opinions than I do on a variety of subjects, on a variety of policies within the capitalist state.
That you see as backwards.
No, I don't see them as backwards, actually. I don't see
this
them
is
as
good.
backwards, because I don't think there is a really easy answer to a lot of the contradictions that we have in society. So like, you want to be pro-life, that's great. I agree. Everyone agrees. Everyone's pro-life. Nobody wants people to have abortions. Nobody, but there are a few, people who will say they do because they're trying to take an extreme position in the political battle. But everyone recognizes that having to terminate a pregnancy is a tragedy in people's lives. Okay, great. I agree. I'm pro-life. But women, when they have a child, have their options as free individuals limited, and sometimes they even get trapped in marriages that they didn't even want, but they had to go into because they got pregnant, and so their freedom is severely limited. And after all, don't we all have, at the very least, our own private property of our own body? Isn't that what bourgeois society is founded upon?
Sure.
So, then I guess I'm pro-choice. So, like, okay, I'm both.
This was like, I think, our sort of shared verbatim line on that issue when I was in the Red Republicans, which was a faction of the DSA that came out of the chapter that I started in Boise. Now, listen,
so what's the socialist answer? But socialist answer is to say maybe we could live in such a way that people have a lot more freedom and control over their reproductive decisions, so that abortion isn't going to be common or even necessary at all. Who knows? Test tube babies could just make this all moot. So we should think about advancing our capacities and understanding, rather than staying mired down in this false dilemma where the truth is we want both things. We want choice and we want life.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry to go to get.
Absolutely. No, it's one of the reasons that I really appreciate where you come from. Also, I got Catrone to say something very similar in the early days when I was meeting him, right? And it's one of the main reasons I kept talking to him was because he's not going to scapegoat people who are a little more traditional on some of these beliefs, right? Whereas a lot of people who call themselves left obviously do. In fact, especially the hyper blue districts in this country are dominated by people who will say, oh, those are the people who want to go and create the Handmaid's Tale kind of reality, right? And it is a way of
we all have our kinky fantasies, right? And who knows who wants that Handmaid's Tale the most? I suspect it might be Democrats who are into that the most. But anyway, go on.
Yeah. Actually, Yela Krepchik, Slavoj's wife, she says the exact same thing at the end of her piece. I forget the name of it, but I talked to her about it on the channel. She literally says it about the Handmaid's Tale. She thinks that this is sort of like a fantasy on the part of the progressives who are saying that. But the reason I bring it up is because when we're thinking about the fracturing, now nobody ever asks me what I'm talking about when I say gerrymandering the Finlichkeit. We don't have time to really get into it here. But the one the one aspect of it that I want to hone in on here is that there are human beings with fundamentally different dispositions. And we could say that that is by nature or by nurture. And personally, I don't think that that is where we should get stuck with this. We should just be realists about the fact that somebody with a fundamental disposition of the type of person who's going to really go for a lot of these conservative views is going to have a very different fundamental disposition from somebody who is right. And so to gerrymander these dispositions, now there's other dispositions that get gerrymandered, but to gerrymander these ones means that the parties say, hey, you're made of a special stuff. You're one of the good people. The people who are made of the other disposition, they're actually the bad people, and it's their fault for all the problems in the world are their fault. We do this at a lot of other levels that are not just the red versus blue American thing. And there's ways that I could get into the disposition thing at a deeper level where it comes down to even maybe your disposition towards a free will account versus a determinist account. Those are themselves dispositional, I think. But we don't have to get into all the variegated ways that this unfolds. I want to focus on conservatism versus progressivism as dispositions. And this is where Lakoff and Jonathan Haidt, like they all both kind of come in with their own sort of evolutionary psychology ways of doing this, and they'll naturalize what the current two-state duopoly has produced, arguably. Now, it might produce those kinds of subjects, but it also might just take for granted that those are a reliable occurring demographic in any human population. And then they kind of just say, oh, I'll take these ones, you take those ones. And then we'll both take turns blaming the other side. What I'm trying to say is you want to organize at the level of society. I agree. And I do also agree that we live in a society. We're talking about the nature of that society and how organizable it is or where to focus that work. And that's the task of theory, I think. But also, obviously, of doing something like you're doing, you're already doing it with the campaign to organize a, so, and then we're doing it with the Agora and our Sarutu instrument that we took across the country over the last few months. So we're all interested in trying to figure out new ways of organizing. I think that's where everybody can see some kind of a similarity here. But I think we have to be realists about the fact that the two sides of my family, which are blue versus red, which are Democrat versus Republican, they really are I mean, yeah, I can get them in the same room and we can all have tacos together, but the possibility of raising that to anything else is almost, I don't want to say it's impossible, man, but the 5D chess that I hear you playing, which is the same line that I held when I was in the Red Republicans, is catered to a very big brain kind of worker. And what we have are a kind of normies that are so radicalized right now, but within the Democratic or Republican parties, and it's Tucker Carlson versus Rachel Maddow. And I don't know what to do about that. I feel like that's one of the biggest problems that we're running into.
Well, I want to say something about different dispositions and how we can overcome that. And here's my real quick, hopefully witty response. I'm straight. I think people with different dispositions can work together.
Sure you are.
No. I think that people with different dispositions can work together and live together and fall in love. So that maybe wasn't as funny as I'd hoped it to be. But the point is that I think men and women have different dispositions for a variety of reasons. Maybe biological.
Okay, hold on. Let me clarify. I think the reason the joke was over, you weren't saying you're straight and you can work with a gay man. You were saying you're straight, so obviously you work with the opposite sex.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay.
I'm straight. Okay. I can work with people with different dispositions. If I was a gay man, maybe I couldn't. I don't know how. I mean, I suspect that even amongst gay people, there are different dispositions. Someone takes the masculine, someone takes the feminine. I just think that's how things go. But I'm Gen X.
Okay, I got
I'm
you.
backwards. Yeah, no, I'm straight. I think people with different dispositions can work together and even fall in love. So what are we talking about here? We're not talking about some intrinsic natural division between Republicans and Democrats. We're talking about some things that you're talking about, different geographical locations, different industries that they're in, different levels of education, and a really unfortunate collapse of the notion of society, the notion that despite these differences, we're actually all working on the same side, or we're the collapse of a demos, say. But this broken mass democracy that includes terrorism as an aspect of it thrives on breaking up families this way and dividing people against each other.
100%.
And if I were to try to bring people together in a family, I would do so on the basis of the family, not on the basis of what's going to be helpful for politics. Like that. So basically like my family, like I would try to, and I have. My parents are Democrats, rabid anti-Trumpers. I got in trouble with my mother once because I referred to the Democrats as the Democrat Party. I hate the Democrat Party, and she's like, that's like using the N-word. How dare you call them the Democrat Party? So definitely big time.
Now I instantly want to say it. Yeah.
No, I know, but I was in my 50s, so I could suppress that adolescent rebellion. But right. But at the same time, another part of my family, actually on my mother's side, all Republicans, all Trump supporters, Catholics. And it's a strange people in my family. So, and I've said, look, she's your sister. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if she likes Trump and you don't. She's the only sister you're going to have. Reach out to her. Mend this fence or whatever, but whatever what you're supposed to say, mend the bridge. Reconnect, because I think that's how we should just behave, and regardless of our politics, like the people who are closest to us, our family, they matter. Unless they are murderers or terrorists, you shouldn't disown them because they think differently than you do, or they voted a different way.
Did it happen? Did the fence get mended?
Somewhat. In a precarious sort of way on that one argument. Yeah. But the tensions are still there.
I guess I just want to say ditto across the line on all of the things you're saying there, and that the impossibility of getting certain dispositions to work together, when I'm thinking about that, I just want to I don't want people thinking that I'm so Baudrillardian that I'm just a complete black-pilled, nihilist. I'm not at all. I'm not the postmodernist some people take me to be. No, I do believe there are things that we can do. I think that you're doing experiments. I'm doing experiments. We're all doing experiments. Okay. But part of it is to not speak to or center the fringes, the ones that have become these radical normies. Now, I'm not talking about I also don't think that we should be centering or trying to synthesize the reds and the browns, for instance. I say those are fringes, exclude them. And then the other fringes to exclude would be the people who think that my dad is a Nazi just because he has some conservative views, or that my mom is some kind of a fascist just because she's, a Christian conservative. I think that there's a sensible and excluded overwhelming majority of America that does not vote. And it does not vote because it does not feel hope in either side. And it also doesn't want to scapegoat either side, or whichever side it's supposedly supposed to in the moment. And the question is how to organize ourselves in a way that we can work with those people and kind of, I don't know what it means yet. I don't exactly know who they are, but I mean, they are the truckers and the gas station workers and the random receptionists that we've been interviewing across country over the last month and a half of this tour. And the overwhelming majority of them are not very politicized. In fact, I'd say that the radicalization of the certain kinds of normies that want to villainize and scapegoat one another, those people are so repulsive that they have created like this these mashed potatoes, these hash browns, whatever they are, of people who are kind of just saying, I'd rather not. It doesn't seem worth my time. It doesn't seem worth my energy. It doesn't seem worth the effort. It seems too polarized. It seems too divisive, but also it seems like the government and the businesses do not have our interests at heart. That does seem to be the actual pulse of every workplace I've ever been in, as well as all of the places that I'm going to across the country. The only issue is how they conceive of politics itself, but also their sort of addiction to the niches that they exist within and their inability to communicate outside of those, which comes down in part to the structural stultification of time energy, how that produces a sort of functional illiteracy, and how that results in the thing that I call the genocide of voice. And so I think what you're talking about doing with society is something similar to what I'm interested in, which is people still exist. People are not fully captured. Not everything we do is reducible to capital or its dictates. People find ways of contorting themselves to have a little bit of a life outside of it. The thing is that does seem to get captured by the spectacle. And so how do we break it? And that is that. And how do we break it outside of just the first world? Right. That's the problem. Right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think if we could focus on breaking it on the left, and I think you're a part of the left. I know you say you're beyond left and right, but I think you're definitely part of the left as I've known it. And if we could just break it on the left, if we could get the left to be as smart as these apolitical people and say, I would prefer not to the majority of the things that are on offer as political choices for the left, we would be at a really good starting point. And then if we could recognize that there are people who are working class that have immediate needs that they have to meet by working together and creating, whether they're like illegal associations or fully recognized civil society institutions, that these things are going on, and that it would behoove us to be a part of them rather than part of some racket within the capitalist state. That I think we'd be walking towards the possibility of being political again. But as if we think our choices are to try to build a coalition of Republicans and Democrats for some third party, I think we're just going to be in a dead end because we're really still trapped within the framework that we've been given.
Both plantations, right?
Right.
I guess I'll take it as a compliment, first of all, that you call me left, because I know that to you that's synonymous with like smart or good or politically salvageable, and that means you lost cause in your mind, and that's nice. So I appreciate
it doesn't mean that exactly. It means that you are aiming to change society in a direction of creating more freedom for people and having more self-responsibility and self-direction and autonomy. It doesn't mean you don't seem to me to be someone who's saying what we need to do is simply perfect the society as it is and purge these people who are dissatisfied or subdue them so that the smart people can run the show properly. The difficulty is some group of outsiders who are mucking up the system.
I like the sound of that so much, except that then it also, that definition of left would include like most conservative Republicans that I know who
I happen to think
expand freedom.
I think in the United States, often enough, not when push comes to shove with the vision down the line, but right now, like libertarians, which are conservatives, they're better than like 90% of the so-called left in the United States. I trust them a lot more than I trust most of the so-called left. They are not likely to try to cancel me over what I say. No. As an example, they
They're not going
that
to just
doesn't-
see you as a white guy. Like, they're not going to just say, oh, well, you're a white guy. Take the knee, bend the knee. You're not supposed to have an opinion. You can't disagree with people. They're not going to do that to you.
Whereas a lot of the white left will say that to me. I've never had that said to me by anyone who's a black or Hispanic, or no one has ever said that to me.
Never.
Well, maybe on Twitter.
Broad. I spent enough years in the Gay Straight Alliance and the Black Student.
Oh, well, you didn't say
university.
gay. I didn't say gay. I've had lots.
But also Black Student Union. But also the Black Student Union, where it's just like in both sets and settings, I was supposed to kind of play a functional role and not have an opinion or a voice or an intellect for that matter. Right. Mm-hmm. I was supposed to be a body that serves whatever the clique of 3 to 5 people in the group out of 30 thought is the will of their minority. Right. So,
well, it's easy for me to say I've never had a black person tell me that when, I live in Portland, Oregon, so I don't talk to black people. So I don't even know what they would say to me.
Oh my God. Because there aren't any in Portland. I get it. Right. Okay.
I'm just kidding around. But no, I haven't been to college in a long time. I mean, I haven't worked in university in a long, long time. But for the most part, the people who are Hispanic or black or Asian or what have you, who are non-white, don't tell me to shut up based on me being white. They might tell me to shut up.
Yeah,
a variety of things.
Other things. Yeah. Mm. Well, I think your distance from college and time and when you were there might make it easier to try to think that word left is worth salvaging, even though you're on the internet, and so you still feel some of the repercussions of what's going on there right now.
Yeah, it's worth salvaging to me because I'm not going to let these bastards take it from me. I've been a leftist my whole life. I'm not suddenly they come along, these upstarts, these millennials and Zoomers, and say, "Oh, actually, being the left means just being an automaton for the Democratic Party," or whatever they say. And like, no, I'm not. I'm sorry. I made a zine in 1992. I know what being a leftist is.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, Benjamin. I know that we in our close here. I kind of want to kick it over to you and let you say a sort of, I know you've got a lot of thoughts here, and maybe you can close it out in a way that sets us up for a follow-up conversation. There's several aspects of this that I want to get into, like why I really think Doug's commitment to the dictatorship of the proletariat and the word left itself creates more problems than not, whatever, blah, 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 blah. There's all these things that I still hold to. I'd like to maybe dig deeper into it some other day. But especially on the question of the medium and the implosion of space and time and the need to reintroduce cooldowns and effort buffers and a kind of distance, yet a kind of asynchronous simultaneity that harnesses aspects of the internet, but develops a new kind of not hardware, not software, but I call it boomerware or Amishware. There's a kind of internet that I think, and a kind of organizing that we're on the forefront of with what we've been doing. And we're in the process of writing out the little manifesto on that. So for folks who are losing hope, I just want to say it, everyone in the audience, I hope hearing Doug and Benjamin, and you should all definitely listen to their podcasts and everything. But I hope that this conversation gives you all a strong sense of where we're coming from and the fact that there's a lot of reasons to not be losing hope right now, actually. Just because the super blue-brained, red-brained types of people in the world have the worst sky-is-falling sort of narratives about what's going on doesn't mean that the people who are literate and actually doing theory and organizing agree with those people, and that if you feel that way, you might be a little too in the TV or a little too in certain armpits of TikTok, and there's other frontiers, folks, and humanity's a lot more complicated than your media diet has made it out to be.
Well, this has been a good time. It seems that while Doug and Dave understand what's going on a little bit differently, there's still a lot of overlap, so much so that Doug would call Dave part of the left. And I think that goes to show that while there are some differences and some disagreements and some things that we potentially should work through, when they're on a panel with Bill Ayers, they're both on the same side. And there's a lot of Bill Ayers out there.
Yeah, there are.
And not a lot of us.
Yeah, that's true. Although there was a lot of us, there was at least half of us were, I don't know about Alex is the guy who was from Mug, right? But I just want to say to people who might feel hopeless that, especially if they're young, like you should take stock of what's actually happening in your life and not think about what's happening in this big picture way, because most of the people, including me, we're going to describe the big picture to you, especially if they're going to say, well, we have 10 years until climate change takes us out, or we're going to all die in a nuclear apocalypse, or we're going to be living in a police state with chips in our heads, which I think, by the way, is the most likely thing. They're just spinning tales based on their thinking that they enjoy doing. But you have a real life, and you have things that are that you have assets and you have some deficiencies, I'm sure. And don't get mired in your deficiencies. Like, take stock of what you want and the resources you have, and act for yourself first. I'm like Jordan Peterson here. Clean your room. Clean your room. Get out. Do something in the world for yourself first before you worry so much about, whether or not there's going to be a world there for you to actually be in, because there will be. What it will be like, but there will be, and it will be better off if you are not hopeless in it. I love acting like the dad.
Yeah. Well, you are. I met a couple of your sons at the conference. That was really cool. So, all right, everybody, thank you so much. And I hope to do this again soon. I'd like to dig a lot more into some of this stuff, but also I'll probably put a piece out on it.
Great.
All right. Thanks, guys. Oh, and for the people who want to see the panel, there's officially a higher quality version available at the Platypus Affiliated Society channel. They just put it out. Benjamin just shared it with me. We'll link that in the description down below, as well as the comment section, as long as you folks remind me, because I'll probably forget. But also, there'll be an even higher quality version that comes hopefully soon on the TU channel, because Will was there with his gear. And so, yeah, we've got something awesome coming soon. So, yeah. All right, Doug, thank you so much, man. This was a pleasure.
Great. Thank you.
Benjamin, thank you.
Can we?
We cannot do direct revolution, but the only way to lay the foundation for it is to do what you are doing to move the underground. It's a theoretically correct title.
Theory Underground exists to cultivate the conditions necessary for a working class intellectual renaissance that goes beyond old political categories or other identitarian niches. At TU, autodidact workers with earbuds and professionals who see no future in existing institutions or movements are able to challenge their doxa and develop an understanding of the situation we are in.
If you subscribe at theoryunderground.com, you'll get access to a package of courses, including my Intro to Fault Line Theory, which includes Intro to Nick Land and Intro to Slavoj Žižek. These courses are being woven with the 3 courses that take place on a month-to-month basis, spread out throughout the year of 2025. Those courses are 12 Core Concepts and the Fundamental Problems with the Situation Today with social theorist David McKerracher, 12 Essential Political Thinkers with political theorist Benjamin Studebaker, and The Philosophy of Nature with philosopher Nina Power.
The way these all get woven together at a deeper and more meta level is through the ongoing research seminars led by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Michael Downs, where they engage with one another's work by sharing developments from their own perspectives, theory, and research.
If you subscribe at higher levels and support our work, we'll support your development with bespoke teaching. Alone and unaided, we struggle to grasp our situation in its fullness and formulate a meaningful response. By working together and pooling our energies, we can do better. Join us at theoryunderground.com/subscribe.
There'll be two kinds of people in 10 years. Those who said, I knew all along Theory Underground was going to make this huge difference. Those are the people that are like Nance, who were on the sidelines at one point and then said, nah, I'm going to get in. I'm going to roll up my sleeves and I'm going to go hard. And then there's another kind of person, a person who waits in the wings, collects receipts, and who will say in 10 years, oh yeah, I was there. I saw that happen. And then they'll gossip monger. Listen, if you want to get involved, get involved. But if you're going to sit there in the bleachers, well, here's some popcorn. I hope you have fun.